Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you hear from Anita already?
No, she hasn't texted me.
So she was, I think she's a special rapporteur, so she's had to go.
So
Yeah.
Elaine should be joining by now. Um, well, maybe we can start talking a bit before you have to leave. Um, hi everyone. I'm Josefina Blasco Firpo. I'm an agent and collaborator from Rosario, Argentina, and international affairs student. And we are joined by Jade McLachlan. Am I pronouncing it right?
McLachlan, yeah, it's a Scottish pronunciation, sorry.
Well, she's worked among the United Nations, British government, and she has a deep and profound experience in when it comes to diplomacy and policy making. And we should be waiting for Elaine also from the UN SDG Joint Fund as well. But just to start talking about um, what we can do in order to have governments interested in the topic of circular economy and sustainability, because we already have an agenda that's going on and that has been set it like in 2015, but we haven't seen really like let's say an enhancement in when it comes to sustainability. So I'd like to see your opinion on that and what governments are doing actually now.
Sure. I mean, I can talk to how governments respond. Well, certainly from my experience in responding to areas that cause a great deal of anxiety and activism, and how in reality, what's really needed is very, very concise messaging and very consistent requests with a degree of clarity in terms of how things are wanted to change, because often the space is quite noisy. And I have spoken before, for example, when there was the March on Washington, the Women's March on Washington, and everybody who went to that march had very, very multiple issues that they wanted to raise within that sort of protest. It was very difficult for, on the administrative side of government, to advise the politicians on what exactly is needed when there are multiple issues on the table. So often, you have this divide between the administration and the elected side of government, which needs to be briefed, which needs to also be to survive as a leading party, to be, they're often tied to what's the populist ways of thinking. So even if they have sympathy for a particular cause, if it's not going to get them a vote, they tend not to make things happen. So it really requires a degree of creativity, but also consistency in the messaging. And that's where I think it's necessary to, although there was that discussion around bringing people to the table, real people to the table who are in those circumstances that require to be understood properly, there also has to be a degree of intercession. And by that, I mean people who are willing to bridge the gap in understanding. So like an advocacy role, which is to say, people come to the table, explain what it is that's really needed and how things are needed to change, but be able to be facilitated through that process so that they have the biggest impact they can have for the decision makers to make the decisions that are necessary. So that often requires a third party, so an intermediary, an intercession. And that's really what's missing, I think, in the debate or in the whole policy making, because there's such a disconnect between both the sort of cultural divides, communication divides. There's a trust issue because there's a different spectrums in terms of activism on climate change and all the conditions that have been caused by climate change. We do need to bridge that gap very, very urgently, I think, between and intergenerationally even between different sectors. So that's what will change, I think, policy. That's what will make the difference, and that's what we need to focus on from my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, well, regarding we've seen many people like raising their voices. I mean, we have the case here at the Louvre a few days ago talking about hunger, poverty. I mean, we speak from a Global South perspective. We're actually an NGO that comes from the Global South and wants to raise the voice of those who do not fit the system. Actually, there are indigenous people who cannot make it, who do not have access to technology or Korea tech and everything that's going on. So, well, Equipo Nosotros does have an United Nations consultative status, but I mean, I think the intermediate that you're actually speaking of is probably like an NGO or someone who's an activist, and that's when I want to mention actually the role of that the youth plays, because I the way I see it, I do feel that governments have been away from what's going on, and maybe young activists have been raising their voices and have like have given the views on everything on social media and the role that social media has been playing. So how can we or I mean, how can you as a government advisor and former diplomat advisor can I mean, what's the role that you guys play when it comes to, well, approaching this type of problems that people who are far away um from the cities and from the main capitals? What do we do? What do you think that UN should tackle with? What's your view on that?
Well, I can speak from the perspective of the organization I'm sort of augmenting now, which is the International Organization for the Least Developed Countries. And one of the biggest missions that we have right now is it's a newish mission, which is to say that having been at the World Economic Forum in Davos and then all the discussion at Dubai this year, COP, that you get the people who are typically always at the table at these discussions. And while, of course, the likes of this NGO and Hechos por Nosotros and other NGOs exist, there's still the financial inability to actually identify people who could speak to the actual issues within those regions, and then to have the financial ability to bring them logistically to these discussions. And so part of the issue is persuading donors, other foundations to fund that process. That's the first part. And the second part is enabling, in a sense that you, having worked in government where you had to sit down and brief, whoever the principal was, whether it's a more senior member of government or whether it's a politician, on the issues and how they should be responding. In a way, what you need to be doing is acting as someone who's briefing somebody to attend these discussions, how to get the most of the discussions, how to make their voices heard in a way that's going to result in some definitive, tangible action at the end of it. And that's, that does require a lot of research by the intermediary to make that happen. It can't happen with just the two sides, in my opinion. I think it needs to have that middle intermediary role. But the financing is critical, because without the financing, you can't make that happen.
Yeah, probably. I mean, the fact that we lack funding. I mean, especially when I speak of we, I do refer as NGOs from the Global South, because from the least developed countries, it's actually really hard to be listened to. And so I mean, we have these whole institutions like World Economic Forum, World Bank, but we also need the private sector to actually pay attention to this and see what this indigenous and people who lack access to the system itself can bring to the table. Because I mean, they do have different development models that we haven't paid enough attention to, and that maybe could boost at some point our economies, and because we're so focused on fast fashion, and I think, I mean, fashion is actually a topic that brings us all together now because we all use clothes. But maybe if we had like governments and the help with AI and different things, we could connect more. So do you think that maybe UN can actually work with NGOs like more deeply with people in their own territories? I mean, and with financing from the World Bank, what can we do with multilateral institutions for the 2030 agenda? And I do not speak only of countries, but also of institutions as well.
I think that, sorry, if anyone else wants to speak
Yeah,
to this,
sure.
then yeah, then by all means. I mean, the UN has such a huge set of responsibilities, and I think that it does a lot in that regard. So there's lots of activity, particularly around peace building and, you know, pulling out elections in war-torn countries, etc. So I think it's really up to it's at the moment it's all about financing, which is a pity that Anita couldn't make it, because the financing part of it is absolutely critical. And then the second part is the communications. I think if the financing is there first and we bridge the gap in the communications and dispelling some of the perceptions, because when we talk about Indigenous cultures, in Indigenous cultures, there was and is a degree of intercession, just to say that elders of you know, a great amount of Indigenous communities act as or provide intercession to the younger members of the community with their more modern ideals, and the two are blended together in a very, very seamless way and have been for you know, countless years. And that's what's missing. It's that blend of ideals, it's the mediation, it's the coming to levels of compromise and understanding that's completely missing in our vernacular, because people are afraid to ruffle feathers, because there's a cancel culture. People are afraid to that the older, let's say, community are often not always, because it's not always happens, but are often disinclined to say anything that might make them exposed in some way. And the younger community haven't had the guidance from the people who are on their side. So there's something really, really missing in bridging the gap and intergenerational ways of communicating and making things happen.
Yeah, so the way I see it is actually there is this fear of defying the status quo, that people that I mean, it's normal because we've done things in a normal, in, let's say, a normal way, or a way that has been ordinary, and with a fast fashion industry leaving people out of the system. So what NGOs do try to do is actually like bring those people to the system with their own tools and not trying to take their culture away from them. So that's definitely something that governments like should highlight. Because here at Hecho por Nosotros, we have, we've been at the UN environmental program, and we've done plenty of research on how to do that. We've had a special case in Peru, as Paco spoke previously. So I mean, the main issue that we have to tackle, and I say it not just because of for campaigns and for political campaigns, because it's a topic that's really used when it comes to political campaigns and stuff. Maybe like just put the focus and highlight the fact that the lack of access is essential. Oh, there's a question, I think.
Yeah, go ahead,
Imani?
Yeah,
Imani.
hi everyone. My name is Imani. I'm coming from the United States. I worked with Hector Notros a few years ago, actually, during the pandemic. So it's so exciting to be back in the company and just talking about sustainable fashion and those topics as well. I didn't have a question, more so as a comment. You spoke about Indigenous communities and about how they have this kind of like connection between the older generation and the newer generation. And that connection kind of brings a structure to society that we might not see as present in first world countries. I guess I wanted to discuss more about how do you help these indigenous people highlight the tools in their own community and still like add to their essence without like westernizing it too much. I guess that's something that, like you said before, needs to be highlighted, but something that I wonder we can go into more depth and detail about.
Totally. I mean, my view is that if we only lived like that, just generally, things would be not in the state that they are now. So
Mm,
I'm not sure. So there are two things really, aren't there? There's the supporting Indigenous communities to continue the practices and traditions that have sustained them since time began. And there's also allowing that support to enable individuals or select individuals who are able and willing to come to explain and storytell as part of the policy making process. It's the sort of two-pronged approach which is
mhm.
needed. And so that's exactly what we're trying to do at as the International Organization for Least Developed Countries, was identify those processes, enable a sustenance of those traditions, as well as representation where it matters. And that's I mean, that's a drop in the ocean, but more and more people should be considering doing things along those lines.
Yeah. And it really spoke to me because I recently got invited to serve overseas in Tonga, which is like an indigenous community out in Oceania. And I really want to bring these ideas of like policy making and sustainable fashion too. I've been watching a lot of YouTube and a lot of people who live there, and they're actually surprised to see how they're keeping up with the trends through fast fashion, through like Shein and these other outlets that we know because we have access to know like what these conglomerates actually produce and like how damaging they are to the environment. But kind of these smaller countries, they're trying to keep up with a more Western world or these ideals that you
Right.
kind of talked about. So I definitely want to have myself be aware and aware of how I'm coming in as someone who is an American into this community.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Nicholas, did you want to say or
Yes.
ask something?
Hello,
Hi.
I'm Nicolas from Argentina. I have a question. Do you think that the cooperation between universities and schools can make more conscious about sustainable fashion? And do you think what can help in case that governments doesn't pay attention?
So, do you mean in terms of the curriculum at universities supporting sustainable fashion?
Yes, perhaps to create more conscience, more knowledge about that, and help to teach the people about global warming and other topics.
I think that that's
And sustainable fashion. Sorry.
yeah, no, absolutely, and it's a really good point, and I think it's beginning to happen. I can see it already as part of an education movement, and I know personally of a teacher in an international school for school leavers about to go to university who was frustrated at how sciences were being taught with excluding the issues around the environmental impact of things like fashion and supply chain, etc., that she ended up creating her own or founding her own education company, which would educate school leaving age, so 16 to 18-year-olds, on circularity, on sustainable fashion, on climate change consequences, etc. So there is the swells of that movement. I don't think it's happening quickly enough, but I think absolutely universities should change curricula or adapt curricula to consider these things that are just part of our lives. So they shouldn't be ignored. It's not a frivolous issue. It's part of our everyday living. So it should be part of our educational structure, absolutely. And sorry, I forgot your second question, Nicholas.
How do you think that the people can make that the government paid more attention about these issues?
Well, like I said earlier, I think that the noise, and that's unfortunately the way that it can seem, because it's so, there are just so many facets to this issue. And then you have events like of understandable protests. Some are more visible and politically challenging than others. But I think when you make a case very, very clearly in a very specific forum with people who are qualified, experienced, and able to make the point. And by qualified, I don't mean educational qualifications. I mean life qualifications, having the lived experience to be able to speak to these issues. Then policy can change. But I haven't seen a great deal of government policy change through sheer activism, honestly. And so
Yes, sorry, sometimes I think that the lack of some political parties that, you know, some in Europe and United States, I think there are some green parties, but we have a lack of this in Argentina, and perhaps that's a trouble for us.
some what parties, sorry?
Some ecologists, the green parties, you
Right.
know, some political parties that they take the climate change and other topics like a key of their programs or some important topics to take out to the governments.
To have debates on. It doesn't exist in Argentina so much.
Not so much.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, definitely. And in fact, my mother was a member of the Green Party many, many years ago in the 80s. And so it has existed in the UK, certainly for a long time, but not with any level of political sort of power, unfortunately. But it's definitely been very prominent, and at least it adds to the discussion, and it provides some balance to the discussion, because there's always, and there always will be, and they always have to account for very, very polarized opinions on all the issues. And so if you anticipate there being a great number of people who take the opposite side, the opposite opinion as you, then you can have a proper conversation. If the expectation is that either no one's going to listen within a debate, or that people are all going to understand your point of view, then the debate goes nowhere, and policy doesn't change so much, because the conversations are just circular. But there has to be a process of dialogue and negotiation and compromise and incremental change, because change doesn't happen overnight in policy.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
However, let me do add up to the fact that that I mean, people have raised up their voices through social media. I mean, I think that TikTok actually, like nowadays, is the main social media that governments should be paying attention to, and that the population has expressed themselves, have been expressing themselves through that. So, I mean, do you think that maybe social media can have an influence in just shifting the attention towards a more sustainable system by raising the attention on social media? Do advisors look at social media, at public opinion, when it comes to policy making, when it comes to making different projects of law? For instance, here in Argentina, we are now having a giant project of different laws that are like being treated at the Congress, and many are about the environment itself. So how do we raise the attention of governments through social media? How do you think so?
I think social media definitely helps shift the needle in public opinion. And I think governments respond to public opinion. So it is a sort of byproduct of a sort of mass movement on whatever that movement is. I definitely think social media is really, really powerful. It indirectly affects government policy, but not directly. But I do believe, obviously, that there are people on the administrative side of government who will pay great attention to what's happening in terms of global movements, in terms of what the public are much more responsive to and what's causing the greatest amount of alarm and therefore needs the greatest amount of attention. So I think that it's a really powerful platform for sure. And especially because it is the voice of the younger generation and it has to be listened to. There are no two ways around it. You have to honor and respect the voice of the younger generation